On April 27th of the year 2000, an airport police officer was going through the contents of a car that had been parked illegally. He then grew concerned when he found a woman's cell phone and purse, since someone catching a flight probably wouldn't willingly leave these two items behind. But the other items in the car were even more concerning. The officer found printed out emails addressed to the White House that talked about secret investigations and being followed. He also found 2 books about changing your identity and a drawing that was as confusing as it was alarming. The car, as it turned out, was registered to a 25-year-old woman named Star Palumbo, and by the time this officer found her belongings, she had already disappeared. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. Your mid-20s are a difficult time for a lot of reasons. It's a time of change, of growth, and of settling into the adult world in a way that doesn't feel quite the same as turning 18 or 21 did. I know that for me, the biggest jump was health insurance and everything that comes with it. And to be honest, it had been probably 4 or 5 years since I'd even been to a doctor, since, it's a little awkward to keep seeing your pediatrician at a certain point. And the most daunting part of that task was finding a new primary care provider. It's such an incredibly personal relationship, and the one that I'd had before was there when I was born, so how exactly do you just start that whole process over again? For me, it was a lot of Googling, Facebooking, and calling various practices, but for you, it could be a lot easier. At least if you use today's sponsor, ZocDoc. ZocDoc is a free website where you can easily search and compare high-quality in-network doctors so you can find the right doctor for you. Whether you're looking for someone in-network, nearby, or with specific appointment times, ZocDoc helps you quickly find the right doctor for your needs with no guesswork and no phone calls needed. Plus, with tons of verified patient reviews and detailed doctor profiles, you can get a real sense of the provider and their practice before you ever step into the office. The best part is that you can see the doctor's actual appointment openings, choose a time that works for you, and click to instantly book a visit. ZocDoc appointments also happen fast, typically within just 24 to 72 hours of booking, and you might even manage to score same-day appointments. And for those of you with phone anxiety, you don't even need to talk to anyone. Just book with a few clicks. And ZocDoc isn't just for primary care either. They have more than 100,000 providers across nearly every specialty, from mental health to dental health, eye care to skincare, and much more. In other words, it is a one-stop shop for all your healthcare needs, and again, it is completely free. So stop putting off those doctor's appointments and go to ZocDoc.com/LoreLodge, which is also linked in the description, to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. Star Michelle Palumbo was born on March 29, 1975. And while there isn't a ton known about her upbringing, her mother Gail described her childhood as a very happy one, although one that was not without stressors. Star was from a military family that moved around from state to state, and anyone who's been the new kid in a new school knows how fraught with anxiety that process can be, especially when it happens multiple times. Still, Gail said that Star was happy, social, and trusting, although in one case of foreshadowing, Gail also said that her daughter may have trusted people too much. But as time went on and Star entered her mid-20s, something shifted. She'd had a few run-ins with police when she was younger, and while the charges weren't anything that would turn your hair white, some underage drinking, trespassing, driving violations, those run-ins with police grew more and more frequent through 1998. Now, these new encounters with the police, as she grew into a young adult, were mostly for petty crimes, never anything violent, and Star reads like a good person who was struggling to find the right foothold in life. We don't know for sure what Star may have been grappling with, but we do know that in 1999, when she was 24, she packed up her things and moved roughly 850 miles away from her family home to Lockwood, Nevada, a small, unincorporated community just outside of Reno. Star may have just wanted the change of scenery that living near Reno could provide, and since her grandmother lived there, she had an affordable place to sleep. But it's also possible that Star was trying to escape some bad influences in Arizona. After all, grandmas can be good at slapping your hand and setting you on the straight and narrow. But unfortunately, Reno can be good at doing exactly the opposite. Whatever the cause of this move, once the move had occurred, Starr began working at a pawn shop in Sparks, which is a town right outside of Reno. And apparently there is a local saying which goes, "Reno is so close to hell, you can see sparks." However, according to Reno police detective David Jenkins, who worked on Starr's case, Starr's friends in Reno stated that her pawn shop job was not covering the cost of a drug habit. Detective Jenkins told the show Unsolved Mysteries, which profiled Starr's case back in 2001, and then again in 2008 during the Dennis Farina years, that Starr seemed to have fallen in with a very bad crowd and was becoming more and more distraught. Shortly after she disappeared, Starr had written a journal entry which clearly indicated that she was struggling with her mental health and probably much more. She wrote, "I just found out that this world is made up of lies and deception, and I really feel robbed of my life. At this moment, I am alone and I need help." Which, with everything that's going on recently, I get it. This journal entry seems to coincide with the fact that about a month before Starr went missing, she moved out of her grandmother's house and stopped working at the pawn shop. And all of this also seems to correspond with a reported change in Starr's personality. Up until that point, Starr had regularly called her mom to check in, filling her in on what she was up to in Nevada while getting updates about friends and family back home. But in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Gail Palumbo noticed a change in her daughter. The steady, reliable woman Gail had known dissolving into what she called a paranoid, maybe delusional person who may have been using drugs. And this tracks with what police believe as well. They claim that Starr was increasingly using drugs, specifically meth, and in his interview on Unsolved Mysteries, Detective Jenkins doesn't sugarcoat his opinion at all, stating that the police believe Starr had been involved with methamphetamine at a level that could only be disastrous. Now, Detective Jenkins never clarifies why police seem to have known this for a fact, but in the absence of Starr's case file, it's probably safe to say that interviews with Starr's friends in Reno provided some illuminating information. However, in spite of all of the drugs and the changes and everything, Starr's strange behavior in the 2 days before her disappearance was still puzzling. On April 25th, 2000, the day before she disappeared, Starr made what would be her final phone call to her mother. In that call, she sounded afraid and told her mom that she believed somebody was following her, but that she didn't want to say too much because she thought the phones were tapped. She also believed that her roommate was an undercover police officer and that her life was in danger. Even though she wouldn't elaborate on exactly what she believed was going on, she did tell her mom that she had made some mistakes in her life, but wanted to turn things around, fly back to Tucson, and start over. In fact, Starr reportedly had plans to return home to Tucson and to her family that same week. But Gail would never hear from her daughter again. In the middle of the night, sometime in the earliest hours of April 26, 2000, a Reno Tahoe International Airport police officer received a report of a woman wandering in a restricted area of the airport. And some reports say that she was on the tarmac itself. That woman was Starr Palumbo, and she appeared to the responding officer to be confused and disoriented. Starr told the officer that she was trying to find her younger sister, who was lost and needed medication. But police would go on to learn that Starr did not have a younger sister. And this is when things get frustratingly unclear. We don't have Starr's case file because her case is still considered open, and while we requested to see certain parts of it, such as emails and interviews with airport staff, that request was denied. For the record, however, everyone that Bethany, our other writer and researcher, spoke to was incredibly friendly and helpful. But here is what is unclear. The responding officer, whose name we don't have, reportedly didn't believe Starr's story about her sister and thought that she was hallucinating. Newspaper coverage describes Starr's behavior as erratic and, kind of flippantly, if you ask us, it says that she babbled to the responding officer. And yet, the officer reportedly believed that she did not have any criminal intent, and so, despite her strange behavior and apparent hallucinations, he did not detain her, take her to a hospital, or attempt to contact her family or friends, at least insofar as we're aware. Instead, Starr was driven to the nearby Reno Hilton Hotel and Casino, now the Grand Sierra Resort, which is about a 7 to 10 minute drive from the airport. And this is where things get super frustratingly unclear. Depending on which version of the story you get, Starr was either driven to the hotel by the responding officer himself, a cabbie that the officer had called for her, or an employee of one of the businesses inside of the airport. There's even some disagreement online about whether the responding officer was a member of the airport police or if he was airport security, but most of the contemporary accounts say he was an airport police officer, so we're going to be going with that. And the reason this is so frustrating is that knowing who drove Starr to that hotel is incredibly important, because that is the last person to have seen her alive. Again, at least that we know of. However, one thing that all accounts of this story do agree on is that the last confirmed sighting of Starr Palumbo was around 1:30 a.m. on April 26, 2000, outside the Reno Hilton Hotel and Casino. But there is no record of her checking in. Now, if you're a younger viewer and you're wondering how someone could possibly get into a restricted area of the airport, especially if Starr really did make it all the way out onto the tarmac, here's some wild information about how airports used to be. And again, this entire part was written by Bethany because I was not there for this. I mean, I was, but I was... baby. Most of my memory of 9/11 is adults being upset about something. I mentioned 9/11 because this case happened in the year 2000, and airport security before the September 11th, 2001 attacks was very different than what we have today. First of all, TSA was not a thing, nor was having your ID and boarding pass checked multiple times before you ever got to your plane. If you want a really crazy one, people who weren't flying could actually still walk right up to the gate without having a boarding pass, and photo IDs actually weren't even required by security until the year 2002. Very often, if you and your luggage made it through a medical detector, you had just passed all of the screening you would get. So Starr was able to wander in and around the airport without being questioned, and it's not hard to imagine that restricted areas had the same kind of lax security. It's likely that Starr simply wandered down a corridor or through a door whose only security was a restricted access sign. And this difference in airport security is also important because, without access to her case file, we don't know for sure who the last person to see Starr alive was. Because the TSA had not yet been created, there wasn't one centralized security agency responsible for stopping 0 terror attacks in the last 21 years. That's right, in its entire lifetime, the Transportation Safety Administration has not stopped a single airport or airline terror attack. They have groped a lot of American citizens, though. But back then, you didn't have one useless organization. You had a number of smaller, privately hired organizations of varying quality. To illustrate that, just a month before Starr went missing, the security company contracted by the Miami International Airport was fined $110,000 for falsely certifying on at least 70 occasions that criminal background checks had been made on employees. The same employees who would have access to secure areas of the Miami airport. Honestly, when you think about it, $110,000 seems super low. Super low fine, even in 2001. To make matters worse, according to a March 2000 statement from the U.S. Department of Transportation, as a result, some employees were hired who might have presented a security risk to the traveling public. It seems very relevant that security guards entrusted with passenger safety might not be too well vetted or have someone's best interests at heart, especially when we don't know for sure who drove Starr to the Hilton. Now, is it a long shot that a security guard with bad intentions was put in charge of driving her? Probably. It's usually someone you know. Crimes of opportunity like that are exceedingly rare. Is it worth keeping in mind until we know for sure that, yes it is. In any case, the day after Starr was found and brought to the Hilton, airport police officer Barry DeBoer checked the license plate of a car that was illegally parked and appeared to have been abandoned. The plates showed that the car belonged to Starr Palumbo, and inside, police found Starr's cell phone, her purse, and $600 in cash. But that wasn't everything. Police also found 2 books on how to change your identity, and there were copies of emails that Starr had sent to the White House, wherein she fearfully explained that she had inadvertently stumbled onto a dangerous investigation and worried that she was being followed. Perhaps the most confusing item police pulled out of Starr's car, however, was an unsettling drawing of a woman who had been bound around the waist and mouth. Next to her, someone, purportedly Starr, had written, "I didn't know we were forced to have Jack in the Box," alongside the Jack in the Box restaurant's head and cone hat logo, which had been crossed out. As far as we're aware, and please correct us in the comments if we got this one wrong, but as far as we're aware, Jack in the Box has never been code for anything nefarious like drugs or trafficking, but also it's not like anybody would really tell us that, unless you want to, anonymously, in an email. Or not anonymously, you could just comment it. That's always an option. All of this said, that's basically everything we know about the Starr Palumbo disappearance, and perhaps that is because the police have not been particularly forthcoming with what they know. Perhaps it's that this case was just kind of a flash in the pan, even though it did make it onto Unsolved Mysteries. Now, what we do know is that Starr was last seen wearing a tank top, jeans, a black leather jacket, and boots, and that she never turned up to claim her car. What we don't know is where Starr was living after she moved out of her grandma's house, nor do we have the identity of the roommate that Starr believed was an undercover cop. And we don't even know for sure if there was a roommate. But because Starr no longer lived with her grandmother and likely hadn't been in constant communication with her, 10 days passed before her grandmother even contacted police to report Starr missing, which she did on May 6, 2000. At the same time, Starr's parents immediately rushed out to Nevada and started handing out missing persons flyers, which mentioned distinctive features about Starr, such as a birthmark that was noted as a distinctive feature to look out for on the skin on the right side of her neck, a slightly darker patch. I actually have the opposite. I have a very pale patch in the same spot, as well as her triple pierced ears. As we would expect of any worried parent whose child has disappeared, Gail was in constant contact with police and passed along any tips she found, which you might note sounds different from a certain other couple we've talked about a lot of times. And also, very much as we tend to see with a lot of these missing persons cases, as time went on, Gail Palumbo even went to speak with psychics. She was desperate for any new or helpful piece of information. But the leads just dried up, and unfortunately, nothing concrete ever came in. The one little thing that did seem like it might bear fruit, at least at first, came in December, about 8 months after Starr's disappearance, when a bar owner named Linda Fields believed she saw Starr, or at least came forward to say she believed she saw Starr. Now, Linda owned the Silver Dollar Club in Elko, Nevada, which is a town about 4 hours northeast of Reno, and she told police that a woman matching Starr's description had come to her bar alone and looking scared. This frightened woman reportedly told Linda that her name was Starr, then suddenly became agitated when she noticed a man peering through the bar's window. Linda claimed that Starr then quickly rushed out of the bar with another young woman, and unfortunately, police were unable to confirm whether the woman Linda claimed to see was actually Starr Palumbo, or whether or not Linda's story was legitimate in the first place. Now, one reason that's a little odd is that retellings of this story often refer to the Silver Dollar Club as the Silver Dollar Casino, which then appropriately raises the question, if casino, where's security footage? The answer to that question appears to be the fact that while the Silver Dollar may have had some machines or gambling on the premises, it was first and foremost a bar, rather than the busy, security-forward type of establishment most of us think of when we hear casino. However, there is still something strange about Linda Fields' alleged sighting, and that is Linda Fields herself. You see, as we dug into Starr's story, Linda Fields' name kept popping up in the local papers, almost always for something different. Property line disputes, approval to tear down a building she owned with her husband, an advertisement for her bar aimed at visitors in town for the annual cowboy poetry gathering, and finally, murder. And so, kind of like when your friend is trying to tell you a really serious emotional story, but you keep getting distracted by the bickering couple crashing out behind her, we need to turn our focus away from the topic at hand for a moment and take a look at someone else. Linda Fields belongs in a Netflix documentary. And while that hasn't happened yet, she did get her own episode of the show Snapped. Just a little spoiler alert. Throughout her life, she lived in California, Nevada, Kansas, and for some reason, the town of North Pole, Alaska. She was a businesswoman who, according to her loved ones, managed restaurants, worked as a farmer, drove semi-trucks, owned a motel, and even operated gold dredges in the family mining operations. So really a jack of all trades here. In fact, she even reportedly once ran a home for children who had been sexually abused, offered land for pregnant horses that needed temporary safekeeping, and was the first to help in floods, fires, and earthquakes, and other desperate moments of need. And the reason I'm stating all of this first is because people are complex, and the rest of the times that Linda popped up in our research did not paint a flattering portrait. Linda would find herself the center of attention in Elko, Nevada, not long after her purported sighting of Star. As the story goes, Linda and her husband, John Fields, were friends with a man named Jaromir Jerry Polensky, a Czech immigrant whom John had met in the 90s and who had, according to Linda, intermittently stayed with the Fields over the years. Now, Polensky struggled with alcohol, and in 2002, he was convicted of a DUI and sentenced to 18 months in prison. Beforehand, he had given Linda a general power of attorney, and this was purportedly so she could watch over his accounts and pay his bills while he was serving his sentence. However, according to court documents, while Polensky was serving his term, Linda was using her power of attorney to liquidate his savings account, a credit union account, a pension plan benefit, and 2 parcels of land, and then transferring the money into an account she shared with John. Linda stated that this was to help pay some of Polensky's urgent debts and to prevent his savings from being taken by creditors. And when Polensky got out of prison in 2003, he moved into a trailer on the Fields' leased ranch and worked for the couple as a ranch hand. By the end of the year, however, Jerry Polensky had gone missing. The next month, January of 2004, his body was found in the frozen Jordan River, with the coroner ruling his cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head. Unsurprisingly, the prime suspects for this murder were none other than Linda and John Fields. In 2007, the couple would actually have separate trials for Polensky's murder, and this is when things sort of go off the rails. Now, the motive in this case was believed to be a $300,000 life insurance policy that Linda had taken out on Polensky, as well as a handwritten will that named Linda and John Fields as the beneficiaries of his estate. Whatever would have been left of it at the time. Now, according to a notation in the will itself, it was written by a man named Sherman Butts on behalf of Polensky, but this isn't something that Butts could confirm since he died in 2004. However, later trial testimony stated that Butts had not written the will, and instead that Linda had forged it. And this theory about a potential motive, that life insurance policy, which made Linda and her husband John both look terrible, was bolstered by a man named Michael Wilson. You see, Wilson had picked up on a lot about the Fields, given that he was dating Linda and living with the couple. In this bizarre arrangement, Michael Wilson and Linda Fields slept downstairs, while Linda's husband, thoroughly cucked, slept upstairs. Though, to be fair, this might have been some form of karmic justice, as it also came out that John, who unhelpfully also went by the name Vern, had cheated on his first wife, LaVon Everts, with that woman's daughter-in-law. There's really no winners in this story. Anyway, the point of this is that Wilson testified that Polensky's life insurance policy was a potential motive, and he also explained that he believed Linda was turned in to police by a former tenant of hers, that being her brother, Mike Walker, who was angry because Linda had evicted him. Confused? That's understandable. To put things simply, Linda Fields was on trial for allegedly murdering a man with her husband, and during that trial, her boyfriend testified that her brother had turned her into police because she evicted him. As if this wasn't already complicated enough, it just so happens that during this same trial, Linda was also accused of attempting to dissuade a witness from testifying against her. Who was that witness, you ask? Well, if you guessed Linda's brother's wife, you would be correct. That's right, the man Linda and John were allegedly planning to frame for dealing drugs in order to get him fired so that his wife couldn't testify was the same brother she had evicted. According to police, Linda and John allegedly formed a plan during jailhouse phone calls, which are, monitored, to make it look like Mike Walker, Linda's own flesh and blood, dealt hard drugs. The idea was that John would tell Walker's boss about his dealings, which would get the husband fired, forcing the couple to move away to find other work, which in turn would mean that the wife, Nikwa, couldn't testify against Linda. This, rather unsurprisingly, did not pan out, and Linda Fields ended up being convicted of murdering Jerry Palensky and was sentenced to life in prison. What might be surprising, on the other hand, is that the sentence was overturned 2 years later when a panel of 3 judges ruled that the jury should not have heard about Linda and John's previous alleged murder plot. As it turns out, this was not the first time that the Fields allegedly tried to have someone killed.
Allegedly.
During Linda and John's first trial for Palensky's murder, the court allowed the jury to hear a taped recording in which John, Linda, and a man named Billy Wells talked over a proposal to have a man by the name of Roy Mobert's car go off a cliff, with Mobert still inside of it. This, it would seem, was their way of getting out of a massive debt that they owed the target, with whom they'd been involved in several legal battles over the years. According to court documents, shortly before undergoing a hospital procedure in 2000, Mobert had given Linda a power of attorney and revised his will to include her and Fields as beneficiaries, which might sound familiar. Then, similar to what happened with Palensky, Linda Fields allegedly abused that power of attorney for her own enrichment. Specifically, Mobert's lawyer, Greg Korn, testified that Linda sold Mobert's bar in Jarbidge, Nevada, and that she took the proceeds from this sale, as well as proceeds from the sale of a house for Mobert, and opened a checking account in her own name. Linda then used this money to buy a vehicle for her daughter and to make improvements on the Silver Dollar bar. Now, maybe she did all of this thinking that Mobert was not going to survive whatever illness had brought him into the position to decide on a medical power of attorney or a general power of attorney. Hard to say. She doesn't appear to have been the brightest woman. Maybe she thought he was going to die and he didn't die. Point is, he didn't die, and then he sued them. Now, they actually managed to settle the suit in 2000, returning to Mobert what money of his they had left, with a note secured by a deed of trust on the Silver Dollar bar for the rest. But that was not the end of things. In 2001, knowing they wouldn't be able to pay off the debt, and perhaps unaware that Mobert had revised his will to remove them as beneficiaries, the Fields approached Billy Wells about a solution to their problem. During this meeting, the trio discussed Wells making an accident happen in exchange for the Fields forgiving a debt that he owed them, plus paying him $1,000 on top of the debt forgiveness. What the Fields didn't know was that Wells was actually a police informant, and he'd been wired up for the occasion after they first reached out to him about setting up the meeting. You may be asking, why was all of this evidence pertinent to the Palensky murder? It's because, according to the state, this whole, hey, Billy, how about you push Mobert's car over a cliff discussion between the Fields and Billy Wells was strangely similar to a discussion the Fields reportedly had with a ranch hand named Ralph Mackley shortly before Palensky disappeared. Apparently, this version of an accident didn't involve a car going over a cliff, but rather Mackley running over Palensky with a front-end loader and pushing his body into the river. According to Mobert's lawyer's testimony, and this is the aforementioned Mr. Korn, the Fields did not have enough money to pay their ranch hand, Ralph Mackley, and they could no longer buy hay on credit. So, a $300,000 payday from Palensky's life insurance policy would go a long way toward helping the couple cover expenses and repay Mobert, which combined with the taped confession about having Mobert killed made them look very, very guilty. Partially as a result of that group of things and all of that evidence, both Linda and John Fields were convicted of murdering Jerry Palensky. But in 2009, only Linda got her first-degree murder conviction overturned, while John's was upheld. The problem which led to this being overturned was that since she'd never actually been convicted of a crime regarding the Mobert situation, the use of that taped conversation as evidence from that initial investigation was legally questionable. So, in 2013, 52-year-old Linda Fields pleaded not guilty to killing Jerry Palensky in a new trial, one which resulted in a conviction for the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter and carried a 10-year sentence. With time served, she was free just a few years later, and she even went on to remarry, this time to a man 14 years her junior. Whatever happiness she may have found was short-lived, however, because in 2022, Linda found herself on the other end of a murder plot, and this time committed by her new husband. All of this is to say that if you believe Linda's story that she talked to Starr in the Silver Dollar Club in December of 2000, then the last person to see Starr alive would go on to commit, voluntary manslaughter 2 years later. As with the airport security guards, drawing too strong of a conclusion here is probably unwarranted, but it's also bizarre enough that none of it should be ignored outright. But of course, when the investigation into Starr Palumbo's disappearance started, nobody knew any of that. The first 2 months of the investigation into Starr Palumbo's disappearance were handled by the Story County Sheriff's deputies. But in mid-July, Reno police took over the investigation and filled the press in on the case. Sergeant Randy Saulnier of the Reno Police Department was pretty clear about the job police had in front of them, but the problem was that that job was not very clear. As he told reporters, 30 different people have been contacted, and they all have conflicting stories. You see, theories about what happened to Starr changed depending on which of her friends detectives spoke to. Some said she was in debt and trying to change her identity to hide from people she owed money to. Others stated that she overdosed and her body was hidden in the desert. And others simply believed that she had just been killed. But aside from the items found in Starr's abandoned car, physical evidence was lacking. Then, in the summer of 2001, an employee in the northern Reno neighborhood of Stead passed by a storm drain and noticed something strange: a human skull. As it happened, the area had experienced extreme thunderstorms the day prior, and the increased water had flushed the skull out of a storm drain. Police then located the remainder of the victim's body, which was still in the pipe, and they quickly concluded that this was a homicide victim whose body had been pushed into a manhole and down the storm drain. The skull appeared to belong to a petite woman, so police wondered if maybe they had finally found Starr's remains. But after comparing the skull's teeth to Starr's dental records, the skull was not a match. Another possible lead arose in Carson City after a man attacked 3 people with a machete in December of 2001. But while that lead proved to be a dead end as well, it serves to indicate the shift in mindset that was happening as Starr's case stretched on. While investigators initially had focused on Starr's reported drug use when they discussed the case in the media, their interest in external suspects now showed an increased willingness to consider foul play. Regardless of where they looked, however, by the end of the year 2001, investigators were stymied. Detective Jenkins, who was the one who was on Unsolved Mysteries, talked to the Reno Gazette-Journal in December and said, "We are getting very little in the way of new leads. Nothing has changed. We still don't have a confirmed sighting of her since the day she was last seen walking into the Hilton." But there were still theories, one of which was that Starr had actually succeeded in changing her identity. Now, this is obviously the most optimistic of the theories, and it is largely based on the books the police found in her car. But unfortunately, it's also the most unlikely. We know that Starr had grown paranoid and fearful that she was being hunted, so it's not hard to believe that this same frantic mindset made changing her identity seem like a reasonable option. However, even if Starr had not been under the influence of drugs, and by most accounts she was, it takes a significant amount of money, time, and planning to successfully change your identity, especially through non-legal means. It's very unlikely that Starr had the type of assets and connections required to become someone else and not get caught doing it. It's also hard to believe that she would put her mother, someone she stayed in weekly contact with, through that type of agony. Another theory, one that seems a little bit more likely, is based on the airport officer or the driver who brought her to the Hilton. And a huge piece of the puzzle that we're missing is what happened between the time that Starr was found at the airport and when she was dropped off at the Reno Hilton. Again, if she was dropped off at all, because we're kind of taking the police's word for it on that point. We do know that Officer Barry DeBoer is the one who found Starr's car, but we frustratingly know very few other specifics. The officer who spoke with Starr at the airport is the last person who was confirmed to have contact with her, but any information about who that is, what exactly the two talked about, or what she said to that officer that made the officer believe she was hallucinating but also fine to be dropped off alone is not publicly available. Obviously, if this officer believed that she was hallucinating, then he or she should never let Starr have go off alone. On the other hand, it is possible that this officer believed he was cutting her a break. He may have looked her up, saw that she had some priors, believed she was truly confused and not trying to commit any crime, and decided to let her go rather than hold her and have her drug use discovered. An impaired person in Reno, Nevada is not an abnormal sight, and the officer might have simply underestimated the danger she was in. On yet another hand, he could have just not charged her. It's an airport. He could have just put her in a holding cell and said, hey, chill for a while. Let's figure out what's going on. Again, somebody appearing to hallucinate does not immediately mean they need to get convicted of doing drugs. There are other methods. But speaking of drugs and the other alternative possibility of mental illness, those are very real possibilities that might look the same. Based on the reports, it does seem that Starr was struggling with, in that moment, some form of psychosis, which is a collection of symptoms characterized by some loss of contact with reality, during which the person may struggle to differentiate between what is real and what is not. We've seen examples like people who believe a celebrity is sending them secret messages, that they're being watched or in danger, or some people just experience auditory or visual hallucinations. And this is a very interesting possibility, an interesting hypothesis, because according to the National Institute of Mental Health, psychosis symptoms and psychotic disorders often start to appear during someone's late teens to mid-20s. And Starr was 25. When these symptoms do begin to appear, people will often show behavioral changes like paranoia, trouble thinking logically, and withdrawing socially before the psychosis itself develops. And if you'll recall, Starr's mom noted that her daughter's behavior had become more paranoid and delusional in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. So while drugs are definitely a possibility, all of this could have been a symptom of mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. But these things can also be caused by sleep deprivation, certain medications, and of course, drug or alcohol abuse. And Reno police told reporters that Starr had apparently taken methamphetamine, a sentiment that her friends seemed to believe as well, since some of their theories involve Starr overdosing or trying to evade a drug debt. Additionally, methamphetamine users are far more likely to experience symptoms of psychosis than the general population. Either way, if Starr was experiencing psychosis, whether due to an underlying mental illness or as a result of drug use, it would go far to explain her paranoia, which in turn could explain why she left everything in her car. She believed she was being followed by the government, and she didn't want to be tracked. There's also another theory as to what happened to Starr, which ties into that angle about the drugs and the hallucinations, but also kind of exists on its own, and that is that Starr had started working as a woman of the night. We do know that she was no longer working at the pawn shop as of about a month before she went missing, and that means that she was likely earning money in some other way. During his appearance on Unsolved Mysteries, Detective Jenkins said that there is an indication that Starr had been dabbling in prostitution, as in her phone books there were references to a number of men. He also said, "We really don't have a good feeling for the extent of the relationships with a number of those men. Prostitution is a high-risk occupation and one of the factors that causes us concern about what has befallen Starr." Because we don't have a ton of information about who drove Starr to the Hilton, we don't know whose idea going to that particular hotel was. If the driver was simply looking for someplace that Starr could get a room and be safe for the night, there were other hotels closer to the airport that they could have chosen. However, it's also possible that Starr herself requested that she be taken there, and maybe she had been trying to get to the Hilton from the beginning, but due to her impaired state, she ended up lost and wandering around the airport. If Starr was looking to buy, or even more dangerously sell, something illegal, a high-traffic, bustling hotel resort would be a better place to do that than, say, an airport divorced dad extended stay motel, and the Reno Hilton was the closest hotel to the airport. While Nevada does have some of the more lax sex work laws in the union, it is still largely illegal in Reno and in Las Vegas. If Starr made the desperate choice that so many before her already had and stepped into the dark world of sex work, it's entirely possible that an appointment turned violent and Starr was killed without anyone around noticing a thing. If she was dropped off outside the Reno Hotel and Casino around 1:30 a.m., as police say, she was a walking mark in that condition at that hour and in that location. A tired officer or cab driver may not have wanted the possibility of taking on an impaired woman, and thus convinced themselves that she was good enough to release into the wild on her own. A predator, however, would see the easy mark immediately. Speaking of predators, it would be inappropriate to not mention Linda Fields. Like I said earlier, the presence of a future convicted murderer, manslaughterer, is strange enough to warrant some attention. If Linda Fields killed Starr, it could explain why she was so adamant about being so sure of Starr's identity, and about the presence of a creepy-looking man looking through the window and a woman leaving with her, both of which would provide some nice suspects to go after if police one day found Starr's body. On the other hand, it's hard to think of a motive for such a crime. Frankly, while Linda had a lot going on in the years after Starr's disappearance, it doesn't make much sense for her to have killed Starr. Based on the legal issues she had in the 2000s, it seems Linda's motivations were purely financial and involved people already in her life, either as friends or acquaintances. As far as we know, Starr was neither. In short, the other two major crimes Linda was connected to had direct financial incentives, while Starr's death would have brought her nothing. In my opinion, it seems much more likely that Linda, assuming she didn't actually see Starr that night, invented the story in order to get her hands on some reward money. I say that because in October of 2000, about 6 months after Starr went missing, the nonprofit organization Secret Witness announced that they were offering a reward for information leading to Starr's disappearance. And because Linda, who was still very much in debt to Mobert, came forward with her story just 2 months later. So, while it is possible that Linda lied about seeing Starr in an attempt to get some reward money, it's unlikely that her potential involvement extended beyond that. And if the better sides of her personality are to be believed, it's also possible that she simply saw a woman in distress and genuinely wanted to help. But given Linda's other troubles and the amount of time which passed between Starr's disappearance and the alleged sighting, I'm more inclined toward the fabrication angle. Lastly, there is one final aspect of Starr's disappearance that cannot be glossed over, and that is the desert. It has been 26 years since Starr went missing, and her body still hasn't been found. And it's not impossible that Starr wandered back out of the Reno Hilton and got impossibly lost in a place that no one ever found her. We have another example of this, which is Kenny Veach, who... There's a lot to be said about that story. We've done a video on it a long time ago. I've been considering doing another one, but Kenny, while he did report some very strange things before he went missing, and he may have shown up again in the years since, he did say he was going to go out walking in the desert with basically nothing but a water bottle and some granola bars in search of a cave he'd already failed to find. And Kenny was a guy, this was out closer to Las Vegas, Kenny was a guy who did this all the time, and he still disappeared. So sure, you can say that it was something else that happened to him. You can say he just had a bad run-in with a rattlesnake. Like, there's a lot of different possibilities here. People can and do disappear in the desert. That's my point. However, in this case, all of the time passing does point a little bit more towards foul play and towards the perpetrator or perpetrators using the vastness of the desert to hide their crime in the case of Starr Palumbo than it does her wandering off. In the state she was in, it is unlikely that she would have made it very far. Now, all of that said, it would certainly be possible for her to go missing in the desert under these circumstances. The question is more, is that the most likely possibility? And given what we know, and acknowledging what we don't, it seems like the more likely possibility is that she was the victim of foul play. And even if Starr Palumbo's case is never fully solved, it's not difficult to see how this happened. There are a lot of lessons that can be learned from stories like this. In this case, a combination of addiction, vulnerability, and a lack of protection during a crucial window are likely responsible for Starr's disappearance, and for those of countless others who came before her and unfortunately will continue to come after her. This is actually something I plan on doing a video about soon, potentially more than one, but we're seeing how it goes. But it's going to be more of a meta-analysis of like, hey, all of these people went missing. How did it happen, and how can you avoid it happening to you? And the reason that I'm considering making a full video on that is that the obvious answer is, well, they went off trail. The question is why. In almost every single one of these stories, it's not how did the person disappear, it's why did they make these series of choices which obviously led to them disappearing. That's kind of what happens when you start asking real questions instead of just asking questions, or writing an entire book series to claim that it's Bigfoot, and then that it's portals, and then that it's aliens, and whatever it is now. I have no idea what David Paulides is up to at this point. All of this said, this is still technically a missing persons case, because we do not have a body for Star. So if you think that you've seen this woman, if you believe that you have heard about this woman, then please do, I was going to say please do let us know. I mean, let us know in the comments, but more importantly, go tell the police, man. Call the Reno Police Department, tell them that you think you have information about Star Palumbo, and go from there. I always appreciate having further information on a case. I'm not law enforcement. Me coming up with an answer or providing information helps absolutely nobody if the police do not act on that information or receive it. Unfortunately, we have learned this the hard way multiple times now. Can think of at least 2 cases off the top of my head where we put together a whole bunch of information pointing to a specific suspect, and nothing was done. All right, that's all of it. I personally don't have a single clue what happened to this woman. I am of the opinion that most likely she was not seen by Linda Fields, but that if she was, it was because of trafficking. I think that this is, she shows up at a hotel not far from an airport, clearly not in the right state of mind. She's clearly been going through something recently. I think that the idea that she was suffering from schizophrenia or some other condition makes the most sense. That can be brought on by drug use. I think that we are looking at a case of a woman who unfortunately fell through the cracks and did not have the proper support system around her. And there's nothing you can really do but remember to check in on your loved ones. Even if they're out somewhere and you feel like you can't handle them, keep an eye on them. Do whatever you can, because there are bad people out there, and those bad people are waiting for somebody to make the kind of mistakes that Star Palumbo made. That is not to blame her for what happened to her, because the only people to blame when foul play happens are the people who did it. But there are still, of course, lessons that you can learn and ways that you can prevent yourself and those you care about from falling into this kind of situation. And for that reason, I think that when you reach a certain lifetime on a case, maybe 25, 30 years, the police should just release the files, okay? I understand why you would be concerned about it, but at the very least, release the information about what we know and redact any names. Because at this point, it is clear that you are not capable of solving it. The very least you can do is give people the understanding of precisely what events led to this happening, so that people like me can communicate why you shouldn't do those things. With all of that said, I do want to thank Bethany Watson so much for writing the vast majority of this episode. I did a little bit of script editing. You would be shocked at how much growth has occurred already with her writing these scripts. It is truly incredible. She's already writing in my voice. So I really just, shout out to Bethany. She has been so awesome. We are paying her. I want to be very clear about that. She is not locked in the basement of the lodge with a typewriter, because it would be really difficult to read a typewriter off of a teleprompter. Like, that's a lot of extra work. If I was going to keep somebody in the basement to write our scripts, I would give them probably like a laptop without an internet connection, but that would be really difficult for them to write the scripts with because they need to do research. So this just isn't the kind of job where I could keep somebody in the basement, so I promise I'm not doing that. Now, on an unrelated note, there is a basement project we need to fund, so if you guys want to support us, you can do so by going to patreon.com and looking up the Lore Lodge and subscribing for just $1. Every $1 you give us will go to feeding the project in the basement, which again is not a human woman. You can also subscribe at higher tiers, but all of them get free, ad-free videos from this channel. You can also check out our other shows like History Unhinged and Weird Bible and Aiden Mattis. I might be streaming a video game a lot in the upcoming few months for reasons that are transparently financial and still unrelated to the project in the basement. And of course, Thornbury has his channel, which is Silver Retention, where he talks about how movies are made. Apparently, silver retention is a term in this process. I have learned. Now, if you don't want to watch our other content, but you do want to taste our deliciousness, you can do so by getting our coffee from Tableau Roasting Co. with a new, and I'm not going to say improved because I haven't tried it yet, but a new blend, which we're hoping is as good, if not better, than the old blend. And I trust it will be. You can also wear our merch from Bunker Branding. It is cozy, it is comfy, it is designed in America. I think it's also printed in America. I think. I'm not making any legal claims on that, but I believe that to be the case. I also forgot to mention we have the Lore Lads, which is our podcast format where we sit down and we just talk across the table from one another. We also, of course, have Discord, which is the best place to get updates on everything we're doing, and that is Discord, bit.ly/join the lodge to get to there. It's free. You get to hang out. People usually don't say racial slurs. There was like one time, but I think we handled it well. More importantly than the Schrodinger's racial slurs, is that you do get the first updates on when everything goes live and what we're up to. Sometimes I'll send memes at 1 a.m. and make the mods really upset because then they gotta wake up. But yeah, that's everything. I'm Aiden Madison. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.